I'm Natalie Crawford, 27 years old, and I should have seen it coming when my own father told me I'd take up too much space at our family dinner table. It was Thanksgiving 2023, and my entire extended family was gathered around that same oak table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up in our small Ohio town. When Dad announced we'd need a smaller table next year because some people just take up too much room, the laughter that erupted from my relatives echoed through our dining room like a death sentence. What happened next changed everything about who I thought my family really was. Before we dive into this story, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this resonates with you at all, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama and finding your strength. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how this tale of rejection turns into the most empowering chapter of my life. Growing up in Miller Falls, Ohio, I was always the bigger daughter, the one who didn't quite fit the perfect family picture my parents had painted for themselves. My father, Frank Crawford, owned the most successful insurance agency in 3 counties and carried himself like the pillar of our community that everyone believed him to be. Behind closed doors, however, he was a master of emotional manipulation who wielded his words like surgical instruments, cutting deep enough to wound but never leaving visible scars. My mother, Janet Crawford, perfected the art of selective blindness. She'd busy herself with arranging flowers or organizing closets whenever Dad's voice took on that particular tone that meant someone was about to be torn down piece by piece. Her philosophy seemed to be that keeping peace was more important than protecting her children, even when that peace came at the cost of our self-worth. Then there was my sister Bethany, 24, and everything our parents had ever dreamed of in a daughter. She'd married her college sweetheart, a wealthy doctor named Marcus, straight out of graduation, and now lived in a pristine suburban home 40 minutes away. Bethany had always been thin, accomplished, and socially graceful in ways that made family gatherings feel like performance reviews where I consistently failed to meet expectations. My struggles with weight had started in elementary school, and instead of receiving support or understanding, I'd been subjected to a constant stream of criticism disguised as concern. Dad would make comments about my portion sizes at dinner, suggest I think about whether I really needed seconds, and remind me regularly that pretty girls don't eat like that. Mom would chime in with helpful observations about how certain clothes made me look bigger, or how I might consider doing something about my appearance. By 27, I was working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown and living in a cramped apartment above Rosario's Pizza. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and my work was actually quite good. I'd won several local design awards and had started building a small freelance client base on the side. But none of that seemed to matter when I sat at that family table. The Thanksgiving that changed everything started like all the others. Extended family had driven in from surrounding towns, including my father's sister Lorraine and her husband Pete, who seemed to take particular pleasure in making cutting remarks about everyone's life choices. The table was crowded with the usual suspects. My grandparents, a few cousins, and the obligatory family friends who'd been adopted into our holiday traditions over the years. From the moment I walked through the door, I could feel the familiar weight of judgment settling over me like a heavy blanket. Aunt Lorraine made her typical comment about how I looked healthy, which in our family was code for "you've gained weight." Uncle Pete asked loudly if I was still playing with computers instead of finding a real career or a husband. My mother fussed over Bethany's pregnancy announcement while barely acknowledging that I'd brought homemade dessert. But it was during the main course that Dad really let loose. He started with subtle digs about how much food was disappearing from serving platters, then graduated to more direct comments about people who don't understand portion control. When I reached for a second helping of stuffing, he actually said, "Maybe save some for the rest of us, Nat." The table went quiet, but not in a good way. It was the kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens. Then came the moment that would replay in my mind for months afterward. Dad looked around the table with this satisfied expression and said, "You know, Janet, we might need to get a smaller table for next year. Some people just take up too much room, and it's getting crowded in here." He wasn't talking about the furniture, and everyone knew it. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. My own family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, found my father's cruelty hilarious. I sat there feeling like I was drowning in plain sight while everyone around me acted like this was normal dinner conversation. Bethany giggled behind her hand. Mom smiled uncomfortably, but said nothing. Uncle Pete slapped Dad on the back like he'd just told the joke of the century. 27 years of emotional abuse crystallized in that single moment, and I finally understood that to my own family, I wasn't a daughter or sister. I was a target. I didn't say a word during the rest of that dinner. I mechanically finished what was on my plate while conversations swirled around me like I'd become invisible, which in many ways I had. When it came time for dessert, I quietly excused myself, claiming I needed to check on something at my apartment. Nobody seemed particularly concerned about my early departure, which told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family's hierarchy. That night, I lay awake staring at my ceiling and replaying every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every moment when someone should have defended me but chose silence instead. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to pack up my entire life and leave this toxic environment behind, even if it meant starting over with nothing. The confrontation with my parents came the next morning when I showed up at their house with 2 suitcases and a speech I'd rehearsed in my car. I told them I was moving away, that I couldn't continue living in a place where my own family treated me like a burden. I explained how their constant criticism had damaged my self-esteem and how Dad's comment about the table was the final straw that made me realize I deserved better. Their reaction was everything I should have expected and nothing I was prepared for. Dad laughed. Actually laughed. He said I was being dramatic and making everything about myself, just like I always did. Mom immediately launched into a lecture about how I was overreacting and being too sensitive about what was obviously just harmless family teasing. They both seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset, like they'd been speaking a foreign language and couldn't understand why I'd misinterpreted their words. When I pressed them about the pattern of hurtful comments over the years, Dad's demeanor shifted from dismissive to angry. He told me I had always been difficult, and that maybe if I'd spent less time feeling sorry for myself and more time working on my issues, I wouldn't be in this situation. Mom nodded along like this made perfect sense, adding that families are supposed to be honest with each other about things that need improvement. The real betrayal came when Bethany arrived for her scheduled brunch with Mom. Instead of showing any support for her sister, who was clearly in pain, she sided immediately with our parents. She told me I was embarrassing the family with my outburst and that I should be grateful to have relatives who cared enough to help me recognize my shortcomings. According to Bethany, I'd always been overly dramatic, and this was just another example of my inability to handle constructive feedback. That's when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While rifling through some papers on Mom's kitchen counter, I found printed emails between my mother and Aunt Lorraine discussing my mental health issues and how the family needed to stage some kind of intervention. They'd been telling extended relatives that I was struggling with depression and possibly had eating disorders, painting themselves as concerned family members trying to help a troubled daughter. The manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. They'd been systematically undermining my reputation while positioning themselves as long-suffering saints dealing with a difficult child. Every family gathering where I'd felt unwelcome and judged hadn't been my imagination. They'd been preparing the ground for exactly this kind of conversation, where my legitimate complaints about mistreatment would be dismissed as symptoms of mental instability. When I confronted Mom about the emails, she didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She said they were just worried about me and thought I might need professional help to deal with my anger issues and victim mentality. Dad joined in, saying that maybe this outburst proved they'd been right to be concerned about my psychological state. That's when the decision crystallized completely. I wasn't just going to move away from Miller Falls. I was going to disappear entirely and build a life so successful and fulfilling that it would serve as the ultimate proof of what I was capable of when I wasn't being torn down every single day. I started researching cities on the West Coast that same afternoon, updating my resume and portfolio while my parents continued their campaign to convince me I was having some sort of breakdown. The final insult came when Uncle Pete showed up unannounced that evening, claiming he was concerned about family drama, but clearly just there to pile on. He spent 20 minutes explaining how I'd always been the problem child and how my parents had sacrificed so much trying to help me become a normal, functional adult. Then he showed me something that made my decision irreversible. A group chat between all the adult family members where they'd been mocking my tantrum and placing bets on how long it would take for me to come crawling back, asking for forgiveness. I screenshotted every message before Uncle Pete realized what he'd revealed, and then I told him and anyone else who was listening that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I was done being their punching bag, done accepting their version of love that felt more like slow-motion assassination. They wanted me gone? They were about to get their wish in ways they never saw coming. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I announced my plan to relocate to Seattle, where I'd identified several design firms that seemed like good potential employers and a job market that could support my freelance ambitions. I expected resistance, but I underestimated the lengths my family would go to maintain control over their favorite target. Dad's first move was financial warfare. He reminded me that I was still on the family health insurance plan through his business and threatened to remove me immediately if I left the state. Since I'd been dealing with some ongoing medical issues that required regular doctor visits and prescription medications, losing coverage would have been financially devastating. He presented this as a caring gesture, explaining that he was just worried about my ability to take care of myself in a new city without family support. When the insurance threat didn't bring me to heal quickly enough, Dad escalated to professional sabotage. He called my boss at the marketing firm and had what he described as a concerned father conversation about my recent behavior and mental state. He suggested that I was having some kind of breakdown and might not be reliable or stable enough to handle my current workload. Within days, I found myself placed on administrative leave while the company reviewed my situation. My supervisor, Karen, was apologetic but firm when she explained that they couldn't risk having an unstable employee working on client projects. She suggested I take some time to deal with my personal issues and reapply when I'd gotten the help I apparently needed. The fact that my work performance had been exemplary didn't seem to matter once Dad planted seeds of doubt about my psychological state. Bethany's contribution to the family campaign was particularly vicious. She called her doctor husband and expressed concerns about my mental health, specifically mentioning that I was talking about moving across the country and seemed to be having delusions about family members plotting against me. Marcus, being a medical professional, apparently felt obligated to share these concerns with someone who could help, so he reached out to our family physician about possibly arranging an intervention. The isolation campaign was methodical and effective. Within a week, I was getting calls from relatives I barely spoke to, all expressing the same scripted concerns about my well-being and suggesting that maybe I should consider talking to someone about my recent behavior. They all seemed to have the same talking points about my history of being sensitive and how stress could sometimes cause people to misinterpret normal family interactions as something more sinister. The psychological pressure was intense, but it was nothing compared to what happened next. Bethany called the police for a wellness check, claiming that I'd been making statements about harming myself and that she was worried I might be a danger to myself or others. She provided them with examples of my erratic behavior, including my sudden decision to quit my job and move across the country without any concrete plans. When 2 officers showed up at my workplace to check on my welfare, it was the single most humiliating experience of my adult life. My coworkers watched as police questioned me about my mental state and plans for the future. I had to convince them that I wasn't suicidal or planning to hurt anyone, while also trying to explain that my family was engaging in a coordinated harassment campaign designed to make me look unstable. The officers were professional but clearly skeptical of my claims about family manipulation. From their perspective, they had a young woman whose own sister was concerned enough to call police, whose father had reached out to her employer about psychological issues, and who was talking about making dramatic life changes without apparent planning. It looked exactly like someone in the middle of a mental health crisis, which I realized had been the point all along. Mom's performance during this period was Oscar-worthy. She called me multiple times per day, sometimes crying about how scared she was for my safety, other times angrily demanding to know why I was doing this to the family. She told anyone who would listen that she was heartbroken about her daughter's breakdown and that she just wanted me to get the help I clearly needed. The victim routine was so convincing that I started getting sympathy calls from family friends who'd known me since childhood. The extended family involvement was like a full-court press designed to overwhelm my defenses. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly calling with urgent concerns about my well-being. Aunt Lorraine left multiple voicemails explaining how she'd always worried that I had psychological issues, like my great-aunt Helen, who'd spent time in a mental institution back in the 1970s. Uncle Pete stopped by my apartment unannounced several times, always with some transparent excuse about being in the neighborhood. Dad's ultimate threat came during what he called a family meeting at their house, where I was essentially ambushed by both parents and subjected to an hour-long intervention about my deteriorating mental state. He explained that if I continued down this path of paranoia and delusion, he would have no choice but to explore options for having me committed for my own safety. He said he'd already spoken to someone about the process and that my recent behavior could potentially qualify for involuntary psychiatric hold. The gaslighting was so intense and systematic that I started questioning my own perceptions. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe their treatment of me had been normal family dysfunction and I was too sensitive to handle it. Maybe I really was having some kind of breakdown and my desire to escape was actually a symptom of psychological problems that needed professional treatment. I was facing financial ruin, professional sabotage, and social isolation, all orchestrated by people who claimed to love me. I'd lost my job, my health insurance, and my confidence in my own judgment. I was starting to understand how abuse victims end up staying in terrible situations. When everyone around you insists that your reality is wrong and theirs is right, it becomes almost impossible to trust your own instincts. But there was one small voice in the back of my mind that kept insisting this wasn't normal and I wasn't crazy. I started researching emotional abuse and family scapegoating online, and what I found there probably saved my sanity. I discovered an entire community of people who'd experienced similar treatment from their families, and their stories were so similar to mine that it was like reading my own biography written by strangers. That's when I found an online support group for emotional abuse survivors, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. The first real validation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Hoffman, my elderly neighbor who lived in the apartment below mine, knocked on my door one afternoon with a casserole and a concerned expression that seemed genuine rather than performative. At 83 years old, she had the sharp eyes and direct manner of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize truth when she encountered it. "I've been watching what's been happening to you," she said without preamble, settling herself into my kitchen chair like she belonged there. "I've lived in this building for 42 years, and I've seen your family come and go. What they're doing to you isn't normal or right, and I think you need to know that someone sees it clearly." Mrs. Hoffman's revelation was like being handed oxygen after nearly drowning. She'd witnessed years of my father's cutting remarks during his rare visits to my apartment, had overheard phone conversations where my mother's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, and had noticed how I always seemed diminished after family gatherings. She told me she'd wanted to say something for years, but hadn't known if it was her place to interfere in family matters. "But this isn't family," she said firmly. "This is systematic cruelty designed to keep you small and dependent." I recognize it because I lived through it myself with my first husband 50 years ago. The difference is that I didn't have anyone telling me I wasn't imagining things. You do. The practical help she offered was as valuable as the emotional validation. Mrs. Hoffman had been a bookkeeper before retirement and had managed to save a substantial nest egg through careful financial planning. She offered to lend me enough money for a security deposit on an apartment in whatever city I chose, with no interest and no timeline for repayment beyond, when you're established and thriving. "I never had children of my own," she explained, "but if I had a granddaughter, I'd want someone to help her escape a situation like this. Consider it an investment in your future happiness. The second ally appeared through social media, which proved that sometimes digital connections can be lifelines when physical ones fail. Wesley Torres had been my lab partner in college chemistry and someone I'd always admired for his combination of intelligence and genuine kindness. We'd lost touch after graduation, but he reached out via LinkedIn after seeing some of my design work posted online. His message started as professional networking, but quickly evolved into something more personal when he mentioned that he'd always wondered how I was doing and whether I'd ever managed to escape my hometown. When I shared a careful version of my current situation, his response was immediate and decisive. He was now running a successful tech startup in Portland and needed a talented designer for several major projects. "I remember how your family treated you during college," Wesley wrote. "I always regretted not saying something back then, but I didn't think it was my place. If you're serious about starting over somewhere new, I can offer you remote work starting immediately, and Portland has an amazing creative community that would appreciate your talents." The remote work opportunity was a game changer. Wesley's projects paid well enough to provide financial stability while I planned my escape, and the work itself was challenging and rewarding in ways my local job had never been. Having a steady income stream that my family couldn't sabotage gave me back a sense of agency and control that had been systematically stripped away. The third ally came in the form of my college roommate Carmen Rodriguez, who called from San Diego after learning about my situation through our mutual friend network. Carmen had always been one of those people who could see through facades and call out dysfunction when she encountered it, and she'd never been particularly impressed with my family's treatment of me during our school years. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to realize what the rest of us could see," she said during our first phone conversation. "Your family is toxic as hell, and you deserve so much better. I have a guest room in my condo that's yours for as long as you need it, and San Diego has a thriving design scene that would be perfect for launching your own business." Carmen's offer of temporary housing was incredibly generous, but more than that, she provided daily emotional support during the darkest period of my life. Our video calls became a lifeline where I could process the ongoing manipulation from my family with someone who had the perspective to see it clearly. She helped me develop strategies for dealing with their psychological warfare while maintaining my own sanity. The planning that emerged from these three unexpected alliances was methodical and empowering. Mrs. Hoffman provided financial resources and local intelligence about my family's movements. Wesley offered immediate income and long-term career opportunities. Carmen gave me a destination and emotional support network. Together, they formed the foundation for a new life that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. But my family wasn't giving up their favorite target without a fight. Dad's response to my improved mood and increased confidence was to escalate his attempts at control. He started showing up at my apartment unannounced, claiming he was worried about my erratic behavior and needed to check on my well-being. When Mrs. Hoffman answered the door instead of me, he demanded to know who she was and what role she was playing in my deterioration. His attempt to access my bank accounts was the wake-up call I needed about how far he was willing to go to maintain control. Dad had been listed as an emergency contact on some of my accounts from when I was younger and financially dependent, and he tried to use that access to monitor my spending and financial planning. When the bank called to verify his authority, I realized he'd been checking my account activity for years without my knowledge. The financial independence that followed was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I opened new accounts at a completely different bank in a different state, with only my name attached and strict instructions that no one else should have access under any circumstances. It was the first time in my adult life that I had complete control over my own money, and the psychological impact was enormous. My mother's escalation took the form of increasingly dramatic manipulation tactics. She started showing up at Mrs. Hoffman's apartment, demanding information about what conspiracy was being planned against the family. When that didn't work, she began calling my new clients directly, introducing herself as my concerned mother and expressing worries about my reliability and mental stability. Bethany's surveillance campaign was perhaps the most invasive aspect of their coordinated response. She started following me around town, showing up at places where I ran errands or met friends, always with some transparent excuse about coincidence. She reported my activities back to our parents with the dedication of a private investigator, noting who I spoke with, what I purchased, and how I seemed to be spending my time. The pressure was intense, but for the first time, I had people in my corner who could see the situation clearly and validate my experiences. Mrs. Hoffman, Wesley, and Carmen formed a support network that made the difference between surviving the family's attacks and being destroyed by them. With their help, I started planning not just an escape, but a complete transformation of my life. 3 months of secret preparation went into building the infrastructure for my new life, while maintaining the appearance of someone who was slowly recovering from a psychological episode. The deception was necessary because any hint that I was planning a permanent escape would have triggered an even more aggressive campaign from my family to stop me. Wesley's remote work projects became the foundation of my growing confidence and financial independence. My designs for his tech startup caught the attention of several major clients, and suddenly I was working on campaigns for companies I'd only dreamed of collaborating with. The work was challenging, creative, and rewarding in ways that made me realize how much I'd been undervaluing my own talents while living under my family's constant criticism. One of my designs went viral on social media, bringing in attention from marketing firms across the country who wanted to hire me for similar projects. For the first time in my life, I was being recognized and valued for my actual abilities rather than being torn down for my perceived shortcomings. The professional validation was intoxicating after years of being told I was barely capable of basic functioning. Carmen's daily video calls became a crucial part of maintaining my sanity during the most intense period of family pressure. She helped me develop scripts for dealing with their manipulation tactics, coached me through difficult conversations, and provided perspective when I started doubting my own judgment. Having someone who could see the situation clearly and validate my experiences made all the difference in maintaining my resolve. Mrs. Hoffman continued to serve as my eyes and ears in the building, letting me know when family members were lurking around or asking questions about my activities. She also helped me craft cover stories that would satisfy their curiosity without revealing my actual plans. Her decades of life experience made her incredibly skilled at deflecting intrusive questions while appearing cooperative and concerned. The most challenging aspect of the preparation was managing my family's increasing suspicion about my improved emotional state. Dad became convinced that my better mood meant I was either taking psychiatric medication or receiving therapy, both of which he seemed to view as admissions that he'd been right about my mental health issues all along. He kept pressing me for details about my treatment and seemed frustrated when I couldn't provide specific information. His attempt to access my bank accounts was a wake-up call about how extensively he'd been monitoring my life without my knowledge. When I discovered he'd been tracking my spending patterns for years, I realized the depth of control he'd maintained over my adult existence. Opening completely separate accounts in a different state felt like the first real act of independence I'd taken in decades. The financial independence that followed was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, I had complete control over my own money and could make decisions without worrying about parental approval or interference. The psychological impact was enormous. Every purchase, every financial decision, every plan I made was entirely my own choice, and that level of autonomy felt revolutionary after years of subtle financial control. My mother's response to losing financial oversight was to escalate her emotional manipulation tactics. She started calling me multiple times per day with various manufactured crises that required my immediate attention and presence. When I began setting boundaries around these calls, she accused me of abandoning the family during their time of need and suggested that my selfishness proved I was still having psychological problems. The coordination between family members became more obvious as they realized I was slipping beyond their control. Bethany started showing up wherever I went, always with some transparent excuse about running errands in the same area. Uncle Pete began dropping by my apartment with increasing frequency, claiming concern about my well-being, but clearly fishing for information about my activities and future plans. Their surveillance campaign was sophisticated enough that I had to develop counterintelligence strategies to protect my actual preparations. I started feeding them false information about my plans, expressing interest in local job opportunities that I had no intention of pursuing, and discussing apartment searches in nearby towns rather than across the country. The deception felt strange, but necessary to protect my real escape route. The moving company coordination required military-level precision to execute without detection. I scheduled the pickup for a day when I knew the entire family would be occupied with Bethany's baby shower, which was being held at a venue 40 miles away. The timing would give me several hours to load my belongings and disappear before anyone realized what was happening. One close call nearly derailed the entire plan when Bethany became suspicious about my suddenly improved mood and increased confidence. She started asking pointed questions about what therapy I was supposedly receiving and why I seemed so much happier if I wasn't getting professional help. Her medical training made her more perceptive than the rest of the family about psychological changes, and she clearly sensed that something significant was shifting in my life. The counter-surveillance required careful management of information and appearances. I had to continue seeming depressed and struggling while secretly building the foundation for a completely new existence. The emotional labor of maintaining this performance while dealing with ongoing harassment was exhausting, but the support from Mrs. Hoffman, Wesley, and Carmen made it bearable. My father's rage when he discovered his blocked access to my financial accounts was explosive and revealing. His anger wasn't about concern for my well-being, but about losing a tool of control that he'd been using to monitor and influence my decisions. The conversation where he demanded I restore his access made it clear that his involvement in my finances had never been about helping me, but about maintaining power over my choices. The protective order that Mrs. Hoffman helped me file was a crucial step in documenting the pattern of harassment and threats that had escalated throughout this period. Having an official record of their behavior provided legal protection and validated that their treatment of me was serious enough to warrant court intervention. It also served as evidence that I wasn't imagining or exaggerating their campaign against me. The final family betrayal came when they convinced extended relatives that I was stealing money from family accounts and using it to fund some kind of delusional escape plan. The lies they spread about my financial situation were designed to turn even sympathetic relatives against me and paint me as someone who was not only mentally unstable, but also criminally inclined. But by that point, their opinions mattered less, because I had built a support network of people who saw me clearly and valued me for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. The foundation for my new life was solid, the financial resources were in place, and the destination was calling. All that remained was executing the escape plan with precision and courage. Moving day required the precision of a military operation and the secrecy of a covert mission. I'd spent weeks coordinating every detail to ensure that my family would be too distracted and too far away to interfere with my departure. Bethany's baby shower was being held at a country club 40 miles outside of town, and I knew that both my parents and most of the extended family would be occupied there for the entire afternoon. Mrs. Hoffman positioned herself as my lookout, stationed by her window where she could monitor the building's entrance and alert me immediately if any family members showed up unexpectedly. She'd prepared a cover story about how I'd gone to visit a friend for the day, just in case anyone came looking for me during the move. Her military precision and attention to detail made her the perfect accomplice for an operation this delicate. The emotional challenge of packing my childhood memories was more difficult than I'd anticipated. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every keepsake forced me to decide what was worth keeping from a life that had been largely defined by pain and manipulation. I found myself throwing away letters from family members, photos from holidays where I looked miserable, and gifts that came with strings attached and expectations I could never meet. The most symbolic moment came when I discovered a box of cards and letters my family had given me over the years. Reading through them with my new perspective was like seeing a masterclass in manipulation disguised as love. Every birthday card had subtle criticisms embedded in the well wishes. Every holiday letter contained suggestions for improvement wrapped in expressions of care. The patterns were so clear once I stopped making excuses for their behavior. Wesley's surprise arrival that morning was an unexpected gift that made the entire process feel less isolating and frightening. He'd flown in from Portland to help with the cross-country drive, bringing a rental car large enough to transport my most important belongings and providing moral support during what could have been the loneliest day of my life. His presence transformed the escape from a desperate flight into the beginning of an adventure. Carmen had coordinated from San Diego to ensure my temporary apartment was ready for immediate occupancy. She'd stocked the refrigerator, set up basic utilities, and even bought flowers to make the place feel welcoming after a long drive. Knowing that I had a destination where someone was actively preparing for my arrival made the leap into uncertainty feel less terrifying and more like coming home. The unexpected obstacle came in the form of Bethany returning early from the baby shower, claiming she felt unwell but probably responding to some instinct that something significant was happening. She arrived just as the moving truck was finishing loading my larger furniture, and her reaction was immediate and dramatic. Instead of asking what was happening or expressing concern about my well-being, she immediately called our father with a level of panic that revealed how threatened she felt by my independence. The chase sequence that followed was like something from a movie, except the stakes were my emotional freedom rather than my physical safety. Dad's car came screaming into my apartment complex parking lot just as the moving truck was pulling away, and his face through the windshield was contorted with rage rather than concern. He jumped out of the car and started shouting demands that I explain myself immediately and return everything to my apartment. His final threat as the truck disappeared down the street was both revealing and pathetic. He screamed that I was an ungrateful daughter who would never survive without family support, that I'd come crawling back within 6 months begging for forgiveness, and that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The words were designed to instill fear and doubt, but instead they sounded like the desperate threats of someone who'd lost their favorite target. My mother's performance was equally dramatic but more manipulative in its approach. She collapsed onto the parking lot pavement in what appeared to be overwhelming grief about my abandonment of the family. Neighbors came out to check on her, and she milked the attention for all it was worth, describing her heartbreak over her daughter's mental breakdown and sudden departure. The victim routine was so convincing that I almost felt guilty for causing her pain. The cross-country drive with Wesley became a 3-day therapy session that helped me process 27 years of accumulated trauma while simultaneously planning for a future that felt unlimited in its possibilities. We talked through specific incidents of family manipulation, analyzed the patterns of emotional abuse I'd normalized, and discussed strategies for building healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. Wesley shared his own stories of family dysfunction and the process he'd gone through to establish boundaries with relatives who didn't respect his autonomy or life choices. His perspective as someone who'd successfully escaped a similar situation was invaluable, and his friendship provided proof that there were people in the world who could love and support me without trying to control or diminish me. The phone harassment that began during our drive was relentless and predictable. My family called constantly, leaving increasingly threatening voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas for me to come home to angry demands that I return their property and stop embarrassing them in front of the community. The escalation in their desperation was actually reassuring because it confirmed that my departure had genuinely disrupted their system of control. Blocking their numbers and changing my phone completely was one of the most liberating acts of my adult life. The silence that followed felt like peace rather than isolation, and not having to brace myself for manipulative phone calls throughout each day freed up emotional energy I'd been spending on defense for years. For the first time in decades, my phone became a source of positive communication rather than stress and anxiety. The arrival in Portland exceeded every expectation I'd allowed myself to have about starting over. Wesley had organized a small welcome party with his chosen family, a group of friends and colleagues who'd become his support network after distancing himself from his biological relatives. Being welcomed so warmly by people who barely knew me but accepted me completely was a revelation about what healthy relationships could look like. That first taste of unconditional acceptance was intoxicating and healing in ways I hadn't expected. These people celebrated my courage in leaving a toxic situation rather than questioning my decision or suggesting I should have tried harder to make things work with my family. They saw my departure as a victory rather than a tragedy, and their perspective helped me begin to see it that way too. The contrast between their response and my family's reaction was stark enough to highlight the difference between love and manipulation. Real love celebrated my independence and supported my growth, while manipulation disguised as love had tried to keep me small and dependent. The distinction was so clear that I wondered how I'd missed it for so many years. 6 months in Portland revealed that I'd been living as a shadow of my actual potential for most of my adult life. Without the constant stream of criticism and manipulation that had defined my daily existence, I discovered reserves of creativity, confidence, and ambition that had been systematically suppressed by family members who needed me to remain small and manageable. My design business exploded with opportunities that seemed to appear from everywhere once I was free to pursue them without interference. Wesley's mentorship extended far beyond the initial projects he'd offered, encompassing business development skills, client relationship management, and the kind of strategic thinking that had been impossible when I was constantly defending myself against emotional attacks. His belief in my abilities was unwavering even when I still struggled to believe in myself. The therapy sessions with Dr. Angela Martinez became a crucial component of untangling decades of psychological manipulation and learning to trust my own perceptions again. She specialized in family trauma and helped me understand how systematically my sense of reality had been distorted by people who claimed to love me. The process of reclaiming my own narrative was painful but essential for building a healthy foundation for my new life. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Dr. Martinez helped me recognize that my family's treatment of me had never been about my shortcomings, but about their need for a scapegoat to maintain their own psychological equilibrium. Understanding that their criticism and rejection had been about their dysfunction rather than my inadequacy was transformative in ways that affected every aspect of my self-perception. The body positivity journey was particularly challenging because it required dismantling decades of internalized messages about my worth being tied to my appearance and weight. Learning to see myself through eyes that weren't clouded by family prejudice was like meeting myself for the first time. I discovered that I actually liked my face, my body, and my presence in the world when they weren't being constantly criticized and diminished. Dating had been nearly impossible while I was living under the weight of family disapproval, but in Portland I met David Kim, a photographer whose gentle confidence and genuine interest in my thoughts and experiences felt revolutionary after years of being treated like a burden. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than power dynamics or attempts to change each other. David's perspective as someone who'd grown up in a supportive, loving family helped me understand what healthy relationships looked like in practice. His family welcomed me warmly from our first meeting, treating me as an individual worthy of respect and affection rather than someone who needed to earn acceptance through perfect behavior. The contrast with my own family's conditional love was stark and healing. Professional recognition began arriving in ways that validated years of suppressed ambition and creativity. A major design award for an innovative campaign celebrating body diversity felt particularly meaningful given my own journey towards self-acceptance. Standing on stage accepting recognition for work that challenged conventional beauty standards while knowing my family would disapprove completely was a powerful moment of reclaiming my own values and vision. Carmen's visits from San Diego became celebrations of my transformation rather than rescue missions to save me from crisis. She marveled at my increased confidence, my thriving business, and my obvious happiness in ways that highlighted how far I'd traveled from the broken person who'd fled Ohio. Her friendship had been instrumental in my survival, and seeing her joy in my success reinforced the power of genuine support versus manipulation disguised as concern. The discovery of my family's social media campaign against me was initially devastating, but ultimately liberating. They'd been posting about my mental breakdown and abandonment of family responsibilities, painting themselves as victims of my selfishness while garnering sympathy from mutual acquaintances. Reading their version of events was painful but also clarifying because it revealed the extent of their need to control the narrative about our relationship. My decision to share my real story publicly felt risky but necessary for my own healing and potentially helpful for others in similar situations. The blog I launched, The Daughter Who Took Up Too Much Space, became a platform for processing my experiences while connecting with other survivors of family emotional abuse. The response was overwhelming and validating in ways that confirmed how common these experiences were. The viral response to my story brought interview requests from podcasts, magazines, and online platforms that wanted to explore the topic of family toxicity and the courage required to break free from it. Each opportunity to share my experiences felt like reclaiming power from people who'd tried to silence and diminish me for decades. My voice, which had been systematically suppressed, was now being amplified and valued. My father's panicked response to the blog's success was predictable and revealing. His demands that I remove what he called lies about our family were accompanied by threats of legal action and claims that I was damaging his business reputation. The irony of him being concerned about his reputation while having spent years damaging mine was not lost on me or the readers who'd followed my story. The legal consultation I sought about his threats was reassuring because it confirmed that everything I'd written was truthful and well-documented. My lawyer pointed out that his threats were actually evidence of the controlling behavior I'd described, and that any lawsuit he filed would likely backfire by bringing more attention to his treatment of me. The knowledge that I was legally protected gave me confidence to continue sharing my story without fear. The one-year anniversary of my escape brought a major magazine interview request that would give my story national exposure and potentially help countless other abuse survivors recognize their own situations. The decision to participate felt both terrifying and inevitable, like a natural evolution of the healing journey I'd begun by leaving my family's sphere of influence. My family's desperation in response to the potential media attention was both pathetic and illuminating. My mother's tearful phone call begging me to come home and stop destroying the family revealed how much their public image mattered to them compared to my actual well-being. Her promises that things would be different if I returned rang hollow because she still couldn't acknowledge that their treatment of me had been wrong in the first place. Dad's escalation to hiring a lawyer for defamation threats showed how seriously he took the threat to his carefully constructed public persona. The irony that he was more concerned about his reputation than the daughter he'd systematically emotionally abused for decades was striking. His lawyer's letter demanding I cease spreading lies about their family was both threatening and absurd, since everything I'd shared was meticulously documented and truthful. Bethany's surprise phone call announcing her second pregnancy and wanting me to be an aunt to her children was perhaps the most manipulative attempt yet to draw me back into their toxic system. Her suggestion that we could have a fresh start if I just stopped talking publicly about our family issues completely ignored the years of damage she'd participated in and her role in trying to have me institutionalized. The manipulation tactics intensified as more extended family members were recruited to pressure me into silence and reconciliation. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly calling with emotional appeals about family unity and the importance of forgiveness. The coordinated nature of their campaign was obvious, but their willingness to participate in emotional blackmail was disappointing even given my low expectations of these relationships. Uncle Pete's confession during one of these orchestrated calls was accidentally revealing and ultimately helpful for my own healing process. He admitted that the family had always known their treatment of me was wrong, but had gone along with it because it was easier than confronting Dad's controlling behavior. His acknowledgement that they'd all been complicit in my emotional abuse was validating even though it came with a request to keep quiet about it. Mrs. Hoffman's updates from Miller Falls painted a picture of a community gradually learning the truth about my family's dysfunction as my story gained wider attention. The revelation that my family had been trying to force her to reveal my current address was particularly concerning and resulted in additional legal protections being put in place. Her loyalty and courage in protecting me while facing pressure from my family was extraordinary and deeply appreciated. The legal protection that my Portland attorney arranged included restraining orders and formal documentation of their harassment campaign. Having official recognition that their behavior constituted stalking and intimidation was validating after years of being told I was too sensitive or imagining problems that didn't exist. The legal system's acknowledgement that their treatment was serious enough to warrant court intervention felt like institutional validation of my experiences. The media attention surrounding my story had unexpected consequences for my family's standing in their small community. Dad's insurance business began losing clients as people questioned his character and integrity based on the documented evidence of his treatment of his own daughter. The public relations nightmare he was experiencing was entirely of his own making, but his attempts to blame me for the consequences of his actions were typical of his inability to accept responsibility. The community response in Miller Falls was divided, but generally supportive of my decision to speak out about family abuse. Many people shared their own stories of dysfunction and praised my courage in breaking the cycle of silence that protected abusive family members. The solidarity from other survivors was healing and helped counter the narrative my family was still trying to promote about my alleged mental instability. Bethany's breakdown and decision to enter therapy marked the first crack in the family's unified front against me. Her growing awareness that she'd been complicit in serious emotional abuse led to her own questioning of family dynamics she'd previously accepted as normal. While I wasn't ready to trust her motivations completely, her acknowledgement that I'd been treated unfairly was a significant development. My mother's ultimatum that I needed to fix this or lose us forever revealed the depth of her inability to understand that I'd already lost them years ago when they chose to treat me as a scapegoat rather than a daughter. Her framing of the situation as my responsibility to repair rather than their responsibility to make amends showed that she still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the problem. The power I felt in realizing that their threats of abandonment no longer frightened me was transformative and liberating. The fear of losing their love had kept me trapped for years, but understanding that what they'd offered had never actually been love freed me from that psychological prison. Their ultimatums had no power over someone who'd already built a better life without them. 2 years after my escape from Miller Falls, my design firm had grown to employ 15 talented creatives who shared my vision of work as collaboration rather than competition. The success felt surreal sometimes, like proof that I'd been capable of extraordinary things all along, but had needed to escape the voices telling me I wasn't enough before I could access that potential. The chosen family Thanksgiving gathering I hosted in my Portland home was everything my childhood holiday memories should have been but never were. Wesley, Carmen, David, Mrs. Hoffman, and 10 other friends filled my dining room with laughter, genuine conversation, and the kind of love that celebrates people for who they are rather than criticizing them for who they're not. The table was large enough for everyone who truly belonged there. Mrs. Hoffman's declining health brought me back to Ohio for the first time since my departure, but this visit was on my terms and for someone who'd earned my presence through years of unwavering support. Caring for her during her final weeks felt like the most natural thing in the world, a chance to return even a fraction of the love and protection she'd given me when I needed it most. The brief encounter with my parents at the hospital was awkward, but not traumatic in the way I'd expected. Dad looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 years, his business struggles and community reputation damage apparently taking a significant toll on his health and appearance. Mom seemed smaller somehow, less formidable than the manipulative force she'd been throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Their attempt at conversation was stilted and obviously calculated, designed to test whether I might be willing to reconcile without them having to admit wrongdoing or take responsibility for their actions. Dad's questions about my business ventures carried undertones of skepticism, as if my success might be exaggerated or temporary. Mom's inquiries about my mental health treatment revealed that they still believed their narrative about my psychological problems. The brief private conversation Mom requested was more honest than anything we'd shared in decades, though it fell far short of the accountability I would have needed to consider rebuilding a relationship. Her admission that she'd enabled Dad's treatment of me and failed to protect me was significant, but her immediate follow-up requests for forgiveness, without any commitment to changed behavior, showed that she still didn't understand the depth of damage that had been done. Bethany's transformation was more promising, but still tentative and conditional. Her divorce from Marcus and commitment to intensive therapy had apparently opened her eyes to the dysfunction she'd not only tolerated, but actively participated in throughout our childhoods. Her desire to rebuild our sisterly relationship was genuine, but her understanding of what that would require was still developing. The boundaries I set for any potential future contact with family members were clear and non-negotiable. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing, commitment to changed behavior, and respect for my autonomy were minimum requirements for any relationship moving forward. Their ability to meet these standards would determine whether reconciliation was possible, but my well-being no longer depended on their choices. Mrs. Hoffman's peaceful death was heartbreaking, but also beautiful in its timing and circumstances. She passed away surrounded by people who loved her genuinely, including me as her chosen granddaughter and several other neighbors whose lives she'd touched through decades of quiet kindness. Her final letter to me described the pride she felt in watching me transform from a broken young woman into someone who could build a life worthy of her talents and spirit. The inheritance she left me was both financially significant and emotionally overwhelming. Her modest house was worth enough to fund the scholarship program I'd been dreaming of establishing for abuse survivors seeking to escape toxic family situations. Her decision to entrust me with that legacy felt like the ultimate validation of the person she'd always seen me capable of becoming. The scholarship fund I established in her honor became a way to extend the kind of practical support and emotional validation that had saved my own life to other people trapped in similar circumstances. The applications we received told stories that were heartbreakingly familiar, and being able to provide escape routes for other abuse survivors felt like the most meaningful use of my success and resources. David's proposal came during a sunset dinner at Portland's highest restaurant, surrounded by our chosen family and overlooking a city that had become synonymous with my freedom and growth. The wedding we planned included only people who celebrated our love and supported our happiness, a guest list that prioritized genuine relationships over biological connections or social obligations. The contrast between my wedding plans and what my childhood family would have expected was stark and liberating. Instead of a large traditional ceremony designed to impress distant relatives and family friends, we planned an intimate celebration focused on joy, authenticity, and the community of people who'd supported our relationship from the beginning. My father's final contact came in the form of an email that was more honest than any communication we'd ever shared. His admission that he'd been wrong to treat me the way he had and his request for forgiveness was significant, but his continued inability to understand the depth of damage he'd caused made immediate reconciliation impossible. Forgiveness for my own peace was different from restoration of relationship, and I was learning to separate those concepts. The blog's evolution into a resource helping thousands of abuse survivors find their voices and plan their escapes felt like the ultimate transformation of my pain into purpose. Every story shared by readers reinforced that my experience wasn't unique or exaggerated, and that breaking free from toxic family systems was both possible and necessary for psychological survival. The Thanksgiving gathering I hosted 3 years after my escape included 25 people who'd chosen to be there because they valued my presence rather than tolerated it. The expandable dining table was both literal and metaphorical, designed to accommodate anyone who brought genuine love and respect to our chosen family celebration. The final wisdom I'd gained from my journey was that taking up space isn't something to apologize for when you're surrounded by people who truly love you. The right people will always make room for your authentic self, your dreams, your voice, and your growth. Building a table where everyone belongs starts with recognizing that you deserve a seat at it yourself. I want to hear from everyone who's watching this. Have you ever felt like you were taking up too much space in your own family? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because your story matters just as much as mine. If this resonated with you, Please hit that like button to help other people find this message, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about finding your strength in impossible situations. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they deserve better than being told they're too much. Most of all, remember that sometimes the best thing you can do for toxic people is succeed wildly without them. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to build your own table where you truly belong.